The moment Jamal stepped into the sleek glass entrance of his company's headquarters, he felt the weight of an unwelcome gaze pressing against him. The security guard by the front desk didn't just glance. He studied Jamal, his expression sharp with suspicion. The air inside the lobby was crisp, the scent of fresh coffee and polished marble filling the space. Employees moved in and out, some chatting in hushed tones, others tapping away on their phones, all too busy to notice the tension brewing near the entrance. Jamal adjusted the cuffs of his tailored suit, his mind already racing through the day's meetings. But before he could take another step, a firm hand came down in front of him, blocking his path. "Hold up," the security guard said, his voice flat but firm. Jamal stopped, arching an eyebrow. The guard, middle-aged, broad-shouldered, with a name tag that read Doyle, stared at him like he was a misplaced package in the wrong building. "ID," Doyle demanded. Jamal reached into his pocket, the motion smooth, practiced. This wasn't the first time something like this had happened. But before he could pull out his identification, Doyle's hand twitched toward his holster, not drawing his weapon, but making sure Jamal saw it. A silent message. Jamal exhaled slowly, keeping his expression neutral. "Is there a problem?" Doyle's eyes flickered with something unreadable. "You can't just walk in here. Employees need clearance." A few heads turned, whispers beginning to stir. Some employees slowed their pace, their eyes darting between the two men. Jamal remained still, his heart steady, his face unreadable. He knew exactly what this was. "I own the building," he said, his voice even, controlled. "And the company inside it." For a split second, something flickered in Doyle's face, disbelief, maybe even amusement. But then, just as quickly, his jaw tightened. "Nice try," Doyle said, his tone laced with condescension. "I don't have time for games. Step outside before I have to escort you myself." Jamal could feel the weight of the stairs now. A group of interns near the elevators exchanged nervous glances. The receptionist behind the front desk hesitated before lowering her eyes to her computer, pretending not to notice. The guard still stood his ground, unmoving. Jamal clenched his jaw, his patience running thin. He had spent years building this company from the ground up, breaking barriers, proving himself in boardrooms filled with people who had underestimated him. He had fought too hard, climbed too high, for this moment to feel so familiar. Doyle wasn't backing down, and neither was he. The tension in the room thickened, the hum of quiet conversation fading into the background. Someone had pulled out their phone. A recording light blinked in the corner of Jamal's vision. Doyle still didn't know who he was. But soon, the entire world would. A heavy silence settled over the lobby, thick with unspoken words. Doyle's stance didn't waver, his posture stiff, his hand still hovering near his belt. Jamal could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him, the unshakable frustration gnawing at the edges of his patience. The receptionist glanced up again, her eyes darting between the two men. A nervous swallow, a flicker of hesitation. She knew who Jamal was. Others did too. But no one spoke. No one intervened. Jamal's fingers tightened around his ID as he finally pulled it from his pocket and held it up. The bold lettering of his name and title gleamed under the polished lobby lights. "Jamal Carter," he said, his voice measured but firm. "CEO." Doyle barely glanced at the card before scoffing. "Nice try," he muttered, shaking his head. "Anyone can print one of those." Jamal's pulse quickened, but his face remained calm. He had seen this before. This refusal to accept, this unwillingness to acknowledge. It wasn't about ID. It wasn't about security. It was about power, about control. A few feet away, a man in a sharp gray suit hesitated before taking a cautious step forward. Michael, the company's chief financial officer. He opened his mouth as if to say something, but Doyle shot him a glare, and the words died before they could form. Jamal could hear the low murmur of employees gathering near the elevators, their whispers barely audible but growing in number. Phones were out now, some discreetly held at their sides, others more brazen, capturing the moment frame by frame. Doyle shifted, his fingers twitching. Jamal took a breath, steadying himself. "I'm walking to my office now," he said, voice unwavering. "And I suggest you step aside before you make this situation worse than it already is." Doyle let out a sharp laugh, shaking his head. "You think you can just walk in here and tell me what to do?" he said, his voice growing louder. "Not how it works." Jamal's patience was razor thin now. He glanced at Michael, then at the receptionist, then at the silent onlookers. "Michael," Jamal said, keeping his gaze locked on Doyle. "Call security." A confused pause. Doyle blinked. "I am security," he scoffed. Jamal tilted his head. "No," he said coolly. "You're a liability." The words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. Michael hesitated only for a second before pulling out his phone. Doyle stiffened, his jaw clenching. His bravado flickered, just for a moment. More people were watching now, more whispers passing through the growing crowd. And then, in the distance, the sound of heavy footsteps echoed from the far end of the lobby. The real security team was on its way. Doyle's smirk faltered as the sound of approaching footsteps grew louder. The air in the lobby was thick with tension, every second stretching unbearably as more employees gathered, their phones discreetly recording. Jamal remained still, his gaze locked onto Doyle, reading every flicker of uncertainty that crossed his face. The security guard's confidence was wavering, but his pride wouldn't let him back down just yet. The doors to the executive entrance swung open, and two uniformed security officers strode in. Their eyes darted across the scene, the gathered employees, the receptionist frozen behind the desk, and finally, the two men at the center of it all. One of them, a broad-shouldered man with sharp eyes, stepped forward. "What's going on here?" he asked, his voice firm but calm. Doyle turned sharply, pointing a finger at Jamal. "This guy refuses to leave the premises. Says he's the CEO." His laugh was forced now, strained. "Obviously, he's not." The security officer's gaze shifted to Jamal, then to the ID still held between his fingers. He didn't need to inspect it for long. Recognition dawned in his eyes. His posture straightened. "Mr. Carter," he said, his tone instantly more respectful. "Is everything all right?" Jamal kept his expression composed, but he didn't miss the way Doyle's face paled slightly at the words. "No," Jamal said simply. "It's not." A murmur passed through the crowd. Employees exchanged glances, sensing the shift in power. Doyle opened his mouth, but no words came out. The second security officer, a woman with a serious expression, folded her arms. "Doyle," she said, her voice carrying authority. "Step aside." Doyle let out a short, disbelieving laugh. He looked around as if expecting someone to back him up. But the crowd was silent now, their stares piercing, unrelenting. "Are you serious?" Doyle scoffed, his voice rising in pitch. "I was doing my job. You were harassing the CEO of this company," the first officer said bluntly. Doyle's mouth opened, then closed. His grip tightened on his belt. Jamal exhaled slowly, watching the man unravel. He knew that look: panic, realization, desperation. But Doyle wasn't ready to accept defeat. Not yet. Then, as if grasping at one last shred of control, Doyle took a step toward Jamal. The security officers tensed. The crowd inhaled sharply. Jamal didn't move. He held Doyle's stare, unwavering, waiting to see just how far the man was willing to go. Doyle's breathing was heavy, his fingers twitching at his side. And then, a voice cut through the tension. "Sir," the receptionist said hesitantly, her voice small but clear. Everyone turned. She swallowed, her eyes darting nervously between them. "I already called the higher-ups." Jamal didn't react, but he caught the flicker of fear in Doyle's eyes. "They're on their way down," she added. A deep, suffocating silence followed, and Doyle finally realized this was bigger than just him. Doyle's jaw tightened as his mind raced for a way out. His usual bluster had failed him, and now the weight of the moment was pressing down on him. The gathered employees stood frozen, their phones recording, their faces reflecting a mixture of shock, satisfaction, and quiet anticipation. Jamal stood tall, his presence unshaken, but his sharp gaze never left Doyle's twitching hands. The security officers flanked the disgraced guard, their postures firm, waiting for the inevitable. Then, the distant ding of the elevator echoed through the lobby. Heads turned as the doors slid open, revealing two men in dark suits. One of them was a tall, silver-haired executive with a sharp gaze, the kind of man who commanded instant authority with a single look. The other, younger but equally intense, had his phone in one hand and a folder in the other. The murmurs in the room died. Doyle swallowed hard. The silver-haired man stepped forward, his expression unreadable. His eyes flickered over the situation, the frozen receptionist, the security officers, Jamal's composed stance, and Doyle's stiff posture. He took his time, his silence stretching the tension tighter with every second. Finally, he spoke. Would someone like to explain? His voice was calm, but it carried the kind of weight that made people hesitate before answering. Doyle shifted uncomfortably. Sir, this man was loitering and The executive's gaze snapped to him, and Doyle instantly fell silent. Then, the man turned toward Jamal. Mr. Carter, he said, his voice smooth but pointed. I sincerely hope there hasn't been a misunderstanding. Jamal's expression didn't change, but the air around him did. His authority wasn't something he needed to announce. It was something that naturally commanded the room. Oh, there's no misunderstanding, Jamal replied, his voice even, controlled. Your security guard decided that I didn't belong here. A few gasps rippled through the employees. The younger executive furrowed his brow, glancing at the folder in his hands. The older man sighed, rubbing his temple. Doyle, he said finally, turning back to the security guard. Did you seriously stop the CEO of the company from entering his own building? Doyle stammered, his face burning red. I didn't know. He didn't look like. He stopped himself too late. The words had already slipped out. The room went still. Jamal's eyes narrowed just slightly, and that tiny movement sent a chill through Doyle's spine. The executive's lips pressed into a thin line. That's what I thought. Doyle took a step back, but there was nowhere left to go. The security officers were still standing there, unmoving. The employees' eyes were locked on him like a jury awaiting a verdict. The younger executive cleared his throat, speaking for the first time. Mr. Carter, he said, would you like to handle this personally, or should we? Jamal didn't answer right away. Instead, he turned his head, looking Doyle up and down. He could see the desperation in the man's eyes now. The fight was draining out of him, replaced by something else. Something closer to fear. Jamal exhaled slowly, knowing that whatever happened next would change everything. And then, he made his decision. Jamal let the silence stretch. He studied Doyle, watching the way his fingers twitched slightly at his sides, the way his shoulders tensed as if bracing for a blow. The power in the room had shifted entirely, and Doyle knew it. The employees were no longer just watching. They were waiting. Jamal turned to the younger executive. What do you normally do with employees who discriminate against guests, let alone the CEO? The young man hesitated, glancing at his superior, but the older executive only folded his arms, letting the moment play out. Jamal stepped forward, his presence commanding. Doyle instinctively took a half-step back, bumping into one of the security guards. His breath hitched, panic flickering in his eyes. I asked you a question, Jamal said, his voice still calm, but now carrying an unmistakable edge. The younger executive swallowed. Normally, that would be immediate termination. Doyle's face turned pale. Wait, I wasn't trying to be. Look, it was a mistake. I thought he was trespassing. He walked in like he stopped himself again, but the damage was done. Like he didn't belong. The unspoken words hung thick in the air. A few employees murmured. A woman near the back of the lobby shook her head, disgusted. Jamal exhaled through his nose. He'd seen this before, too many times to count. The stammering excuses, the sudden regrets, the desperate attempts to twist the blame elsewhere. It was almost predictable, but he wasn't interested in Doyle's excuses. Jamal turned to the silver-haired executive. How many complaints has he had? The older man sighed, rubbing his temple. More than I'd like to admit. A fresh wave of murmurs rippled through the employees. Doyle's eyes darted around, looking for support, but no one was stepping in to save him. You knew? Jamal asked, his voice dangerously even. The executive met his gaze without flinching. Some complaints were inconclusive, but it's clear now we should have acted sooner. Jamal studied him for a moment before nodding slightly. Doyle lunged forward suddenly, desperation overtaking him. Please, Mr. Carter. I didn't mean. Just give me another chance. I got a family, man. You can't just. Security caught him before he could get too close. The moment his arm was gripped, he thrashed. No, wait. This isn't fair. I was just doing my job. Jamal didn't flinch. Your job. He gestured toward the employees still gathered, still recording, their faces a mixture of disbelief and satisfaction. Your job is to protect this building, but what you did wasn't protection. It was profiling. It was harassment. And it stops today. Doyle's face twisted in desperation. You can't do this to me. You're ruining my life. Jamal tilted his head slightly. I think you did that yourself. Doyle's breathing grew ragged as security pulled him back. He was still protesting, still shouting, but Jamal had already turned away. He'd seen enough. The older executive nodded to the security team. Escort him out. He's done here. Doyle's shouts faded as he was dragged toward the exit. The lobby remained eerily silent. Employees exchanged glances, some whispering, some still recording, all of them trying to process what had just happened. Jamal turned to the executives. We need to talk. Now. The silver-haired man nodded. Let's go to my office. Jamal followed, his mind already working through his next move. Because this wasn't just about one racist security guard. It was about the system that had allowed him to stay. Jamal walked through the sleek, glass-walled corridors of the executive floor, his expression unreadable. The senior executive led the way, silent, but there was a tension in his posture, like a man preparing for an uncomfortable conversation. The door to his office closed behind them, muffling the noise of the lobby below. Jamal didn't sit. He stood near the window, looking out at the city skyline. His reflection stared back at him, composed, controlled. But inside, his pulse was steady with something colder than anger. You should have fired him a long time ago, Jamal finally said. His voice was calm, but the weight of his words filled the space. The older man sighed, rubbing his jaw. I won't make excuses. He hesitated. I let things slide. It was easier than dealing with the backlash. Easier. Jamal turned, his eyes sharp. Easier for who? Not the employees he harassed. Not the clients he turned away. The older man's throat bobbed as he swallowed. You're right. He hesitated, then gestured toward a folder on his desk. These are internal reports. Some complaints weren't officially filed. Others were dismissed. The truth is, Doyle wasn't the only problem. Jamal narrowed his eyes and stepped forward. He flipped open the folder, scanning the pages. Incident reports. Witness statements. Some names redacted, others not. His jaw tightened. How deep does this go? The older executive exhaled. Deeper than I'd like to admit. Doyle was just the most obvious. But there are others. Employees in key positions who have created an environment where this kind of behavior is tolerated. Encouraged, even. Jamal closed the folder and placed his hands on the desk, leaning in slightly. You've let a culture of discrimination thrive here. And you expect me to fix it now that it's a public relations nightmare. The older man held his gaze. I expect you to lead. Jamal let the words settle. There was a knock at the door. The young executive from earlier stepped in, his face pale. He hesitated before speaking. There's a situation downstairs. Jamal straightened. What kind of situation? The executive hesitated. Doyle isn't leaving quietly. Jamal's jaw clenched. He was already moving before the young man could finish his sentence. As they stepped out of the office and into the elevator, the tension crackled like electricity in the air. When the doors slid open to the lobby, the scene before them made Jamal stop in his tracks. Doyle was standing near the entrance, flanked by two other men, security guards from his shift. Employees had backed away, their faces tense. A few were still recording. Doyle's face was flushed with rage, his hands clenched into fists. You think you can just throw me out? He shouted, his voice carrying across the lobby. You think I'll just disappear? One of the security guards muttered something to him, but Doyle shoved him off. His wild eyes found Jamal. This isn't over, he spat. You think you can just walk in here and take everything from me? You have no idea who you're dealing with. Jamal's expression remained unreadable, but inside, something dark twisted in his gut. Because for the first time since this had started, he had the unsettling feeling that Doyle wasn't bluffing. The tension in the lobby thickened as Doyle's voice echoed off the high ceilings. Employees stood frozen, watching the confrontation unfold, their phones capturing every second. The security guards hesitated, unsure of how far Doyle was willing to go. Jamal took a step forward, his eyes locked onto Doyle's. He wasn't afraid, but he could feel the weight of the moment pressing down. One wrong move, and this could spiral out of control. Leave now, Doyle, Jamal said, his voice even. This is over. Doyle let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. You don't get it, do you? You think you're in control here. He motioned toward the employees watching. You think these people are on your side? You don't belong here. Jamal didn't flinch. He had dealt with men like Doyle before. Men who thrived on intimidation, who believed their power was untouchable. But there was something different in Doyle's eyes. Something unhinged. You've already lost, Jamal said. "The only thing left for you to decide is whether you leave with dignity or in handcuffs." Doyle's face twisted with fury. His hand twitched at his side, and for a split second, Jamal saw it, hesitation. The kind that came before a man made a reckless decision. The older executive who had spoken with Jamal upstairs stepped into the scene. "Doyle, I suggest you listen," he said firmly. "You've already made this worse for yourself." Doyle's breathing was ragged, his chest rising and falling as if he were barely holding himself together. Then, in a sudden, unpredictable motion, he lunged forward, toward Jamal. Gasps rippled through the crowd. The security guards reacted instantly, grabbing Doyle before he could make contact. A struggle erupted, Doyle thrashing violently as they tried to restrain him. His shouts turned into incoherent rage, spit flying as he screamed obscenities. Jamal didn't move, didn't react. He simply watched as Doyle was dragged toward the entrance. But something about the way Doyle looked at him sent a chill down his spine. "This isn't over," Doyle snarled, his voice lower now, almost like a promise. "You'll regret this." Then the doors swung open, and the guards forced him outside. The lobby remained eerily silent. No one spoke. No one moved. The weight of what had just happened hung in the air like a storm cloud, heavy and foreboding. Jamal exhaled slowly, his hands clenched at his sides. He should have felt relieved. But he didn't. Because deep down, he knew Doyle's words weren't empty. And something told him this was just the beginning. Outside, Doyle was still resisting, his voice rising over the murmurs of onlookers. Security shoved him past the glass doors, but even as he stumbled onto the pavement, he was already pulling out his phone, his fingers shaking with rage. Jamal watched through the glass, his jaw tight. He could see the pure hatred in Doyle's eyes. That wasn't the look of a man who was going to walk away quietly. A security officer turned back toward Jamal. "We'll handle him from here, sir." Jamal gave a slow nod, but his mind was racing. Doyle was desperate, and desperate men did dangerous things. Inside the building, employees slowly returned to their desks, but the energy in the room had shifted. Whispers passed from one cubicle to another. Some still had their phones out, likely already posting the video of what had just unfolded. Jamal turned to the senior executive who had stepped in earlier. "What's his history here?" The man adjusted his glasses. "Doyle's been with security for years. Old school type. He used to be close with some of the higher-ups, but a lot of those guys left when the company changed direction. He's been bitter ever since." Jamal didn't miss the meaning behind those words. And no one thought that was a problem? A slight hesitation. There were complaints. A few incidents swept under the rug. But nothing like this. Jamal exhaled sharply. He had expected resistance when he took this position, but not like this. His phone vibrated in his pocket. He pulled it out and glanced at the screen. A private number. He hesitated before answering. Jamal speaking. A pause. Then a low, raspy voice. "You think you won today?" Jamal's grip tightened on the phone. He knew that voice. "Doyle, you're going to wish you never walked through those doors," Doyle continued. "This isn't over." The line went dead. Jamal lowered the phone slowly, his pulse steady but his mind already calculating. Doyle wasn't backing down. And Jamal had a feeling this was only the beginning of something much bigger. Jamal stared at the phone screen, his mind already moving a mile a minute. He had dealt with difficult people before, but something about Doyle's voice sent a chill down his spine. This wasn't just anger. This was a threat. Outside, Doyle was still pacing near the curb, phone clenched in his fist. He was muttering under his breath, his face flushed with fury. A few security guards lingered nearby, keeping a close watch, but Doyle wasn't trying to re-enter the building. Not yet. Jamal exhaled slowly, glancing around the office. The tension hadn't left. Employees still whispered in hushed voices, some casting uneasy glances toward the doors. They had seen what had happened. They had heard Doyle's rage. His assistant, Maya, approached cautiously. "Do you want me to call the police?" she asked, keeping her voice low. Jamal shook his head. "Not yet. He's not breaking any laws just by standing outside." Maya hesitated. "But that phone call." "I know," Jamal interrupted. "But I need more than words to make a move." He didn't like it. Every instinct told him that Doyle wasn't done. He was the kind of man who saw himself as the victim, and that made him dangerous. Jamal walked back to his office, locking the door behind him. He took a deep breath, then sat at his desk and pulled up Doyle's employee records. If this was going to escalate, He needed to know exactly what kind of man he was dealing with. The file was long. Too long for a simple security officer. Multiple complaints. Altercations with employees. Incidents flagged, but never properly investigated. Each one dismissed with vague explanations, lack of evidence, misunderstandings, conflicts of personality. Then something caught Jamal's eye. A resignation letter. But Doyle hadn't written it. Jamal leaned closer, scanning the document. The signature wasn't Doyle's. It belonged to an old HR director, one who had conveniently left the company a year ago. Someone had forced Doyle out before, and now he was back. A sudden vibration on his desk made him jump. His phone lit up again, another private number. He answered cautiously. Jamal speaking. Silence. Then a quiet chuckle. You should have just let me do my job, Doyle murmured. But now? Now it's personal. The line clicked dead again. Jamal's pulse quickened. Doyle wasn't just angry. He was planning something. Jamal sat frozen, gripping the phone long after the call had ended. The eerie calm in Doyle's voice was more unsettling than his earlier outburst. It wasn't just rage anymore. This was something calculated. A knock at his office door snapped him out of his thoughts. Maya peeked in, her face tense. Jamal, you need to see this. He stood immediately, following her down the hall to the security room. Inside, a guard was rewinding footage from the lobby's exterior cameras. The screen flickered, showing a grainy feed of Doyle standing by the curb, still seething. But then, something else, something far worse. Another man approached him. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a cold, measured gait. He leaned in, whispering something into Doyle's ear. Doyle didn't react immediately, but after a moment, he gave a slow, almost approving nod. Jamal's stomach tightened. Who was that? The guard clicked through the system, checking past footage. No idea. He wasn't here earlier. Walked up like he knew exactly where to find Doyle. Maya frowned. You think he's working with someone? Jamal exhaled sharply, his mind racing. Doyle was unpredictable, but this meant planning. He wasn't just venting his anger. He was taking steps toward something bigger. Zoom in, Jamal instructed. The camera focused on the stranger's face. His expression was unreadable, his eyes cold. Then, just before he turned to leave, he did something that sent a chill down Jamal's spine. He glanced directly into the security camera. Not by accident. Not in passing. It was deliberate. A message. Maya's breath hitched. He knows we're watching. The video showed the man leaving, disappearing into the street. Doyle, meanwhile, checked his watch, then casually walked toward a parked car at the edge of the lot. He got in and drove off. Jamal turned to the guard. Run a facial recognition check. I want to know who that man is. The guard nodded, but his expression was troubled. Sir, there's something else. Jamal braced himself. What? The guard hesitated, then clicked another security feed. We checked the parking garage. The screen changed. A low-angle shot of the underground lot. Jamal's designated parking space was empty, but that wasn't the problem. Someone had been down there. Footprints, still damp from rain, trailed around his car's usual spot. They didn't lead toward an exit. They just circled, over and over, lingering, watching. Jamal clenched his jaw. Doyle wasn't just angry. He was waiting for something. And whatever it was coming soon. Jamal's pulse pounded as he stared at the screen. The damp footprints circling his parking spot sent a clear message. Someone had been watching, waiting. But for what? His mind raced through possibilities, each one worse than the last. Maya swallowed hard. Jamal, this isn't just Doyle acting out. He's planning something. Jamal forced himself to stay calm. Check all security logs. I want to know exactly when those prints showed up and if anyone else was caught on camera. The guard nodded and got to work, scrolling through the footage frame by frame. But before he could get far, a sharp beep rang through the room. The software had found a match. Jamal and Maya leaned in as the screen loaded a file. A name appeared. Thomas Rourke. Jamal's breath caught in his throat. He knew that name. Ex-military. Discharged under suspicious circumstances. A reputation for handling problems outside the law. And now, he was standing next to Doyle, whispering something in his ear. Maya's face paled. He's a fixer, isn't he? Jamal clenched his fists. Yeah, and he doesn't come cheap. The implications were clear. Doyle wasn't just looking for revenge. He was bringing in professionals. People who knew how to apply pressure in all the right places. People who didn't stop until the job was done. A new tension filled the room. Whatever was coming, It wasn't just a heated confrontation. This was about control, power, and Doyle was willing to cross any line to get it. Then Jamal's phone vibrated on the table, snapping him back to reality. A blocked number. Maya shot him a wary look. Don't answer that. But he already knew he had to. Taking a steady breath, he picked up. Who is this? A low chuckle came through the line. Slow. Calculated. You already know who I am, Jamal. Jamal's grip tightened. What do you want? A pause. Then the voice dropped to a whisper. To watch you fall. The call cut off. Silence filled the room. Jamal exhaled slowly. The game had already started. And he wasn't the one making the rules. The air in the security office felt heavier now, thick with unspoken tension. Maya's fingers hovered over the keyboard, her eyes flicking between the frozen image on the screen and Jamal's expression. We need to act now, she said, barely above a whisper. Jamal's mind raced. This wasn't just about a disgruntled security guard anymore. Doyle had called in a fixer, someone with a history of making problems disappear. That meant this was bigger than he initially thought. Maya clicked through the footage, rewinding and fast-forwarding, searching for any sign of Rourke's movements. Then she found it. 2 nights ago, a black SUV pulling into the lot at 3:12 a.m. The driver never stepped out, but the headlights remained off, the vehicle idling in the shadows. A few minutes later, the cameras flickered, static for exactly 8 seconds. When the feed returned, the SUV was gone. Maya rewound the footage and played it again, slower this time. That wasn't a glitch. Someone cut the feed. Jamal clenched his jaw. That meant whoever was behind this had access to the building's security, access they shouldn't have. A sudden knock on the door made them both freeze. It wasn't loud, just 3 measured taps. Jamal motioned for Maya to mute the monitors before he approached the door. He took a slow breath and opened it just enough to see outside. A man stood there, dressed in a dark overcoat. Not Doyle, not Rourke, but there was something cold about the way he looked at Jamal, something calculated. Mr. Carter, the man said, his voice smooth, unreadable. I think we should talk. Jamal didn't move. And you are? The man smiled, just enough to make it clear he wasn't here by accident. A friend of Mr. Doyle's. Maya shifted slightly behind the desk, ready to pull up the emergency alerts. Jamal tightened his grip on the door. If Doyle has something to say, he can tell me himself. The man exhaled, almost amused. He would, but you see, this is beyond Doyle now. Jamal's pulse quickened. The man leaned in slightly, his voice dropping to something barely above a whisper. I suggest you walk away from all of this. You won't like what happens if you don't. Then, as calmly as he had arrived, the man turned and walked away. Jamal watched him go, his fists clenched at his sides. He had dealt with threats before, but this wasn't just a warning. This was a promise. Jamal stood frozen at the door, his pulse pounding in his ears. The man's words lingered like a ghost in the air. This is beyond Doyle now. What did that mean? And who exactly was pulling the strings? Maya's voice broke through the silence. That guy wasn't just some errand boy, Jamal. He knew exactly what to say to get under your skin. Jamal shut the door and locked it. Yeah, and he wanted me to know he wasn't bluffing. He turned to Maya, his mind already calculating their next move. We need more than just security footage. We need proof that can't be erased or explained away. Maya nodded and pulled up a different set of files. I've been looking through the security system's backend. Whoever tampered with it covered their tracks, but there's always a trail if you know where to look. She typed rapidly, bringing up a log of system overrides. Then, she stopped. Here. 2 days ago, someone accessed the security mainframe remotely. They didn't just cut the cameras, they rewrote the data logs. That SUV you saw? It was never supposed to exist in the system. Jamal clenched his jaw. Who has the clearance to do that? Maya hesitated. Only top-level IT admins. And Doyle himself. A sharp knock at the door made them both jump. This time, it wasn't slow and measured like before. It was loud. Urgent. Maya exchanged a look with Jamal. Jamal moved cautiously to the door, but didn't open it. Who is it? A muffled voice came from the other side. It's Leon. Open up. Leon Washington. One of the senior board members. Someone Jamal actually trusted. Jamal opened the door just enough to see Leon's face. The older man looked tense, sweat on his brow despite the cool air. He stepped inside quickly, glancing around before Jamal shut the door. Jamal, Leon started, his voice low. You need to get out of here. Now. Jamal stiffened. Why? Leon's expression was grave. Because you were right. About all of it. And if you stay here much longer, they're going to make sure you disappear. Maya inhaled sharply. Who's they? Leon wiped a hand over his face. The people Doyle works for. The ones who actually run this place. You think he's in charge? He's a pawn. And you? You're the problem they need to get rid of before you start making noise. Jamal felt a chill run through him. What do they want? Leon hesitated, then reached into his coat, pulling out a flash drive. Everything you need is on here. Names, transactions, even the real reason they're targeting you. But once you see it, there's no going back. Jamal took the flash drive, his fingers tightening around it. A sudden buzzing sound filled the room. Maya looked at her screen. Security just locked down all exits. Jamal turned back to Leon. They know you're here, Leon said. And they're coming. Jamal's heart pounded as Maya shut her laptop, yanking the flash drive from the port. Leon moved fast, pulling out his phone and typing a sequence of numbers. The security lockdown meant they had minutes, maybe less, before Doyle's people burst in. The overhead lights flickered, and then the whole building plunged into darkness. A distant alarm blared as a mechanical voice echoed through the halls. Security breach detected. All personnel, remain in place. Leon cursed under his breath. They cut the power. They're going to sweep the building, room by room. Maya was already moving. There's a maintenance exit in the basement. If we can get past the firewall, I can override the lockdown long enough for us to slip out. Jamal didn't hesitate. Let's go. They ran, feet slamming against the cold tiles. Every hallway felt like a trap, every shadow a possible threat. As they neared the stairwell, a group of security officers stormed in from the opposite end. Down, Leon shouted, dragging Jamal behind cover as bullets shattered the glass lining the hall. Maya fumbled with her tablet, fingers flying across the screen. Give me 10 seconds. Jamal pressed against the wall, feeling the weight of everything. His father's legacy, the corruption he'd uncovered, the danger that threatened to erase him completely. Then, a loud click. The system's down. Move. Maya yelled. They bolted, racing through the emergency stairwell. A sharp pain exploded in Jamal's shoulder as a bullet grazed him, but he pushed forward, adrenaline numbing everything else. Leon kicked open the maintenance door, revealing a service tunnel that led straight to the back lot. They sprinted through the dimly lit corridor, the sounds of shouting and boots on concrete fading behind them. The moment they burst into the open air, a black SUV screeched to a halt in front of them. For a terrifying second, Jamal thought they'd lost. Then the driver's side window rolled down. It was Detective Harris. Get in. They didn't ask questions. As the SUV sped away from the facility, Leon handed the flash drive back to Jamal. You have to go public. The longer this stays in the dark, the more powerful they become. Jamal exhaled slowly, staring down at the tiny device that held years of buried corruption. Days later, the news exploded with headlines about the scandal. Doyle resigned in disgrace. His real employers, powerful figures who had operated in the shadows, were exposed one by one. Some vanished before authorities could reach them. Others weren't so lucky. Jamal stood outside his father's old law office, staring at the city skyline. Everything had changed, but at a cost. Leon had gone into hiding. Maya had erased every trace of their involvement. And Jamal, he would never be the same. But maybe that was the point. He turned and walked away, knowing the fight wasn't over. Corruption didn't die overnight. But as long as he had a voice, he would make sure the truth never stayed buried again. Justice isn't about what's easy, it's about what's right. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe, like, and follow us for more gripping stories. Your support helps us continue bringing you powerful narratives that matter.